our speaker for today, who is Professor Joan DeJaeghere. Just to give you a few words on her work and what she does. Professor Joan DeJaeghere is Professor of Comparative and International Development Education in the Department of Organizational Leadership, Policy, and Development at the University of Minnesota in the USA. She's also an affiliate faculty of the Interdisciplinary Center for Global Change. Her scholarship and professional practice are concerned with inequalities in education, focusing on how poverty, gender, ethnic, and caste relations affect educational participation and future civic engagement, livelihoods, and well-being. Professor DeJaeghere's work utilizes and extends a critical capability approach by incorporating other theoretical perspectives, including post-colonial and decolonial approaches. She has 2 books, including Educating Entrepreneurial Citizens, Neoliberalism and Youth Livelihoods in Tanzania, which was published by Routledge in 2018. She's also the author of Education and Youth Agency, which was published by Springer in 2016. She also has numerous articles in journals, including Comparative Education Review, Compare, International Journal of Educational Development, Critical Studies in Education, and Progress in Development Studies. Today, she'll be talking to us about what a relational capability approach means and also what this looks like in education. She will talk to us for about 25 to 30 minutes, after which we'll hear from our discussants for today, who are Dr. Sonia Lutz from the Center of Teaching and Learning here at the University of the Free State, as well as Dr. Tendai Marova, who is a lecturer at Midland State University in Zimbabwe. Following this, we're looking forward to a Q&A session or a lively discussion which incorporates your reflections and your responses following Joan's talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mikateko-Hupner, and thanks to Faith Makonazi, who invited me to this talk in the UFS Capabilities Research Group, and to Lucretia Smith for arranging it. I also want to thank Dr. Sonia Lutz and Dr. Tendai Marova for being discussants, and I look forward to their comments and all of your comments and the discussion following this. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Thank you so much. So first, I just want to say, when I received the email and the request to do this, I was first humbled and both grateful to talk with you about a relational capability approach, because I know that there's just this wealth of knowledge among this group about the capability approach, and also expertise in what this might look like and mean in higher education. So my first thought was a pause, because my expertise in higher education is only from my personal experience and being really faculty and teacher and mentor in that institution. My research is more broadly on basic and secondary education and the education systems. So I will speak today from that perspective. So I want to start today with why a relational capability approach is necessary for justice in and through education. And here I want to take up this question of relational rather than just any capability approach. And as I said a bit ago, I'm going to assume that this audience is quite familiar with the CA, so I'm not going to discuss all the ideas from Sen and Nussbaum and how they've been developed in and through education. Melanie and I recently wrote a chapter in a new book that's out, the Bloomsbury Handbook on Comparative Education, that sort of summarizes the capability approach and its application to various sectors of education. So I would just suggest that chapter to you. What I want to speak to you about is why relational and some of the assumptions that tend to be posed in capabilitarian approaches as they're often used. So I want to first argue that the uses of a capabilitarian approach, as Roybins now calls, there's many different ways to use and apply the CA, is that in those uses, they're not always relational, and they're certainly not always used for transforming inequalities. In fact, Roybins' core modules suggest that one does not have to necessarily convey the particular values that are associated with the kind of well-being. She talks about capabilities and functions as being sort of value neutral. So we could use this approach without necessarily a particular perspective and assumptions about whether well-being equates with justice or not. And another key point that is well accepted now, I think, in the CA is that, of course, education is a foundational capability. But as we have long known, and Walker and Elaine Unterhalter's piece early on into the book in 2007, I believe, really talked about that it can expand aspirations, agency, and real opportunities, but it doesn't always do so. So we have to therefore look at what kind of education are we trying to teach for whom, right? And what does it include and look like? So I also want to assert then that education at nearly all levels, historically and today, is still often very exclusionary. So from that perspective, and as a critical scholar using the CA, I always think about education in the sense that it is imbued with inequalities. So why then would a relational capability approach be particularly important for higher education? And my comments later are going to speak to this approach that could be used across all levels of education, but higher education, I think, is particularly important to think about a relational approach because it has been traditionally viewed as primarily improving one's income, oriented towards the private returns. Now, no doubt there are public returns on higher education, but they're often less than other levels of education. And the emphasis has often been on getting knowledge and skills certification to improve one's employment opportunities. And what this has done is it's turned individuals into more consumers, right? And in the higher education system, into one that's focused on knowledge and skills as commodities, emphasizing the individual to be able to make themselves through their education. And finally, I would suggest that knowledge production and use, and the way we think about knowledge in the higher education system, is often attributed to and consumed by individuals rather than a public good. Now, no doubt there is orientation of a university to the public good, and Melanie's work and many of your work speak to this, I'm sure. But the emphasis has been more so on the individual's attribution and use and consumption of that knowledge. So those are reasons I think that we need to really be able to use a relational approach to capabilities to invert these sort of orientations, these more individualized orientations and more really human capital oriented for one's own investment and economic outcomes, right? And we know that the CA is more than just our economic outcomes. Or is oriented towards more than analyzing our economic outcomes. So I want to clarify before I get started on what some of the key domains or elements of a capability approach. I want to clarify broadly what I think a relational approach is, because I know when I've written about this, both in the article I shared from the HDCJ, and I've written about it in other articles, and I'll speak to later, but I have a new chapter out in a new book that we're about to put out this month on life skills for youth, where I argue for a relational approach. And people often misunderstand when I say relational approach. So I'm not referring here to just relationships with others. Though these are certainly part of a relational CA. A relational CA, I think, is much broader than that. So it's not only about the relationships, social networks with others, relationships I have with family or peers, the way that social capital has often been analyzed. I'm also not referring to relationality as a metaphor only. So here I draw kind of on Patricia Hill Collins, who's has an interesting book out on intersectionality and sort of the core elements of intersectionality, which very much parallel what I'm going to say about relationality, because she puts relationality as a core element of intersectionality. But she talks about we can use these sort of ideas like relationality and intersectionality as a metaphor, but they're not only that. They give us a good sense and a way of thinking about something, but then they can be used analytically for analytical purposes and to specify what are ontological, epistemological, and axiological, or values, right, are about the way that we see the world. So I am using here relationality in an analytical way to describe our ontological principles of how we see the world we live in, especially what we think inequality is, and with an assumption that I believe that the world we live in is an unequal world. And so then that has implications at the epistemological level of how we utilize a relational approach for analysis, right, to understand and change those inequities. So that's my sense of a broad sense of trying to clarify what a relational approach is. What I have here is some core elements to relational approach, and a few of these build off of the work I wrote about and shared with you from the HDCJ, and they, I think, expand upon it. And again, I'm drawing a parallel here to, as I said, Hill Collins's discussion on intersectionality, because she says relationality is core to our analytical approaches, and in that it shifts our focus from sort of these essential qualities of categories, right? So it's easy to use the CA and try to analyze these categories that are personal or environmental or social conditions, things like race or socioeconomic status or geography, right? Even policies, and use those as essential categories. But she says, well, if we take a relational approach, we're not just seeing those as essential categories, we're shifting them to looking at the relational processes that connect them. So I'm going to assume in a relational capability approach that social inequities are really at the center of the work that we do in and through education. Now, one could say some elements of education may not be as concerned with social equities, sure, but I think foundationally we assume that our education is not just to only learn knowledge, it is actually to improve the world in which we live. And that world, as I said, I think has social inequities. So in the center of what I would call these core elements of a relational CA is social inequities. And then one of the first elements is power, right? Power is a relational, It's not static. It's not something that just resides in structures or in people. It is about the relationships between individuals. So the social elements of power is about the relationships between individuals and societal structures. So it's about the material elements of power. And it's also about the discourses, power found in discourses, and the sort of epistemic power that we can have. But another meaning of power that I find really useful is about power as potential or capacity. And in this case, I think it's closely related to this notion of agency, right? The power to be able to have the capacity to be aspirational, to think about what I want to do and can do. So agency then is a second sort of element in this relational capability approach. And of course, then we have to consider if power is about our relations, right, with others, with our social context. We have to understand what is that social context? What are the histories of particular places and spaces and time, and how do we look at these power relations and abilities to have potential, right, or have agency in particular social contexts. Another core element I would argue that's, I think, just important to think about more, maybe at the ontological level, and this actually was also highlighted in the Owens et al. Piece that I shared with you about a relational capability approach from a sort of complexity theory perspective. But Hill Collins also uses this in her key elements of intersectionality, where she talks about we have to understand these relations as being complex and dynamic, meaning that they do not remain static and they're often changing then in these spaces and time. And finally, an element that I add that is not a part of, I think, some of the other pieces I've been talking about is this notion of being transformative. I think we need to use a relational capability approach, not just to analyze the sort of power in the way that exists and reproduces inequities in these social contexts, but we need to look for the spaces and places that it transforms them. And I think by focusing on the transformative, we look for the possibilities or potentials for justice. And I'm really influenced here by two feminist economists, Gibson and Graham, who early on have highlighted in their work about thinking about possibilities vis-a-vis the dominant discourses, in their case, capitalist economies. And they're always looking for where are the transformative spaces for different kind of economies. And I would argue we can look at that similarly for education. So if those are some of the core elements, then how do we make sense of those? And I, in my piece in the HDCJ, have referred to a couple of perspectives or theories that help inform how do we define power, right? And how do we define agency? And what does it mean in these particular social contexts? How do we orient ourselves to social contexts? And a couple of different perspectives I've used are both post-colonial and critical feminist in that piece. And in a different piece that I've written more so on lower caste Dalit girls in India, we use more of a decolonizing approach. But they orient us to different kinds of notions of power and different aspects of a social context. Each of these theories do. So I think it's not just that there's a theory that matters in trying to create a more relational analysis, but they can help us to look for different kinds of things. And so I want to just ask, as we have a discussion, what are some other sort of theoretical or perspectives you use in thinking about how to build out this relational capability approach? Well, to put that to work, though, these sort of approaches and perspectives, I think, pose a set of questions that we need to bring to our analysis. And a few of these questions I lay out in that piece in the HDCJ, and I've developed a few of these further here in trying to think about, both from a post-colonial perspective, how certain colonial vestiges, right, both colonial as in the past, but also present in the today, and the neo-colonial ones that are resurfacing in different ways, are producing these sort of inequalities. So post-coloniality from Spivak, Fanon, others inform us to ask these sort of questions, right? But we can also ask, how can they be actually transformed in the future to address these sort of inequalities, to look at ways that distribution and redistribution can happen, or recognition. I think both post-colonial perspectives and critical feminist ones also challenge us to think about who participates in the education system, right? How do politics of belonging play out in schooling? And who's being othered by whom? And so in this case, Hill Collins' work, Nancy Fraser's work, bell hooks, all of those have informed my thinking around how do we think about who's represented, what sort of associational justice is there or is there not in these systems? But then there's other questions I think we need to get at, and actually, Melanie, your work has started to get into this more, and others in this forum, around sort of episteme and the epistemic justices. So asking questions around what are the assumptions and values in the system regarding the knowledge that's important and how it should be used, right? So trying to reveal that and trying to shift our assumptions and values around knowledge and why it's important. Similarly, then asking not just questions about knowledge and the knowledge we create and use, but knowledge and how it's taught. How do educators actually teach sort of disciplinary and life knowledge? And what are students expected to learn? How can learning be made more relevant and to students' diverse lives? And finally, in this point about the use of our knowledge, and to a lot of work that Melanie and others have written around public good of education and higher education particularly, how is that learned knowledge used in communities for other kinds of, to address inequities, environmentally, socially, sort of the economic elements of justice as well? So those are some questions I think are important. There are probably many others, depending on the critical perspectives or the sort of perspectives we bring to examine different forms of relations between power and agency and the structures that we're looking at. But I want to just quickly give a couple of examples of how one could pose these sort of questions in an analysis, sort of to operationalize this relational analysis to understand both education systems and to how we can transform them. And similarly, how to think about these examples then of education systems and practices that are relational. How can we do things differently to actually shift some of these inequalities, knowing that they will, inequalities are ever moving and changing, so they're going to persist in certain ways. So one example I want to share with you is some analysis I've done of the system in Vietnam. where there's very much a belief and a global discourse that Vietnamese education system is successful. And this is both within the country to some extent, though there are critiques, and internationally. And one example here is in the PISA data that from the 2018 PISA, where Vietnam, for the first time when it undertook PISA international testing, outperformed almost every European country, the UK, the US, and was very high, close to many of the other Asian cities or countries. And so it was regarded as a success story, this outlier, because it was still low to middle income. But the other reason it's been regarded as sort of successful is that it expanded access to basic education in a decade and a half, from very, very low following its wars to 90+% mostly. So it has these high learning outcomes and it's expanded access. And PISA, when it analyzed these learning outcomes, also found that the lowest socioeconomic quintile in Vietnam performs as well as the highest in many other countries, accounting for PPP, the economic differences between countries. So it has there's this discourse about the success. But my own research over about a decade and a half in Vietnam has focused on where are the disparities. It has tried to ask different questions about the data and the discourse that is generally seen about the Vietnamese education system, and to look both historically and present day about where these inequities might continue to exist. So one of the things is we know that ethnic minorities, and there are 53 different ethnic minorities in addition to the majority group in Vietnam, have always been represented less so in the education system. Historically and present day, that gap persists. So even though there's been an increase in enrollment in basic education, ethnic minorities continue to have the same gap, almost as they've had for a couple decades. And when some are completing secondary or tertiary education, it's often difficult for them to actually transfer that degree into work opportunities. So there's still very much discrimination in the system. And I just saw a new paper come out today, which is not very often studied in Vietnam, why and how ethnic minorities aren't able to get jobs once they complete their education. So this hope, right, they have this aspiration to complete, and then it doesn't actually produce both economic or social kind of opportunities for them. And then our analysis, we did some analysis policy discourse a number of years ago, looking way back into the 50s, into the Constitution, and to other policies. And we've more recently looked at classroom practices. And we find that basically society and teachers simply have lower expectations of certain ethnic groups. They when we see how they teach and what they teach, they don't expect many of these ethnic minorities to actually continue on to higher levels of education, and they think that they can't have higher levels of knowledge. So that's just one example of trying to think about how do we take a relational approach to understand different sort of relations of power that exist, different structures in the system, and where agency might exist. Now, we haven't looked as carefully at the forms of education systems, relational aspects in this system that could actually produce positive outcomes in Vietnam. There are some elements we could focus on, but here I want to just suggest a few different ways of thinking about a relational education system that might.
Hi, Joan, you've muted your mic.
Sorry about that. I don't know how it muted. Sorry, when did that just happen now with this? I'll continue with this slide. So I was saying that I think I was giving an example of analyzing the Vietnamese education system through this sort of relational analysis and trying to identify these inequities. But I think we can also use this analysis to try to identify relational education systems that transform injustices. And here's just a few examples of, I think, ways that we could, not superficially, but with in-depth analysis, right, of power relations, certain social contexts, the way the agency can happen. We can look at whether place-based and community education or integrated indigenous knowledge systems or transformative social learning in certain forms can actually create better educational outcomes that also transform injustices for different minoritized groups. But I would love to hear your comments and thoughts on these different kinds of ways to look for relational education systems in our discussion. For just a few minutes, I want to zoom in on the more a relational analysis of pedagogy and practices, and this was really the focus of my HDCJ article, where I look at how can educational capabilities be relational to actually change some of these inequities. And here I want to focus in on a few of those commonly stated educational capabilities, both from Nussbaum and others, right? That we tend to think about that education should be creating affiliation with others. It should be creating critical thinking. It should be creating imaginative understanding. And while I argue in that paper and have since that yes, education can and should do this, I don't think that just because we foster critical thinking in students, that it necessarily changes inequities. That I do think we have to take a more relational orientation to both thinking about what affiliation looks like and how we then teach and foster that through our pedagogical practices and policies. So things like not just simply being affiliated with the fact that I can go to school and have relationships with other people and imagine myself as an educated person. Yes, but how can we then also make sure that you're recognized as an educated person, that we can try to shift those relations with other people to see you as valued by others and having dignity, right? And I talk similarly with trying to shift this notion of imagining a future, you know, having imaginative understanding and thinking critically about what I value in my life and my future goals, to sort of reimagining that, because especially for minoritized people or people who've never actually had the opportunity for education, it's very difficult to imagine what that future would be like. I often think of myself as somebody who came from a family that had not, I was the first in my family to go on to higher education. I had no conceptualization of what higher education would mean and look like, other than the discourse that was around me that suggested that that's what you need to do to be able to pursue work, right? But to reimagine those futures, I needed other people who could mentor me, who could open up opportunities, who could help me understand what those futures could be, and to change some of those relations that would block me from those futures. So I think, and since then, as I said, I have a new book coming out on life skills, and in a chapter in that actually it looks at a relational approach to life skills instead of an individualized one. I briefly talk there about several common life skills, or more the affective components of learning, where we often focus on, I think, an overly individualized notion of who we should be and become through education. So things like developing self-motivation, right? Motivation to and goal orientation. And I argue that, excuse me one moment. I argue that we have to not only think about an individual's goals, because they may or may not be able to be attained unless we help provide them with some of the collective supports and collective aspirations to attain those. And I look at other affective components like empathy and positive attitude as well, and the more individualized nature of them versus a more sort of relational approach to them. So I want to just leave our conversation with having us think about what are the different kind of pedagogical practices that we might use in our context for fostering relational capabilities in a system, and even at the very level of our policies and practices in these different levels of education that we might work in. And finally, I want to just pose the question to you of how might you use a relational capability approach? What sort of theories or perspectives inform it? What questions do we need to ask? And what's missing in this conceptualization of a relational capability and its uses? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor DeJaeghere, for a fascinating talk. I think we're all kind of, challenged to think about the question that you posed, especially at the end, in terms of how we might use a relational capability approach, what it looks like, what other theories we might incorporate. And I think this is a challenge to all of us who tend to use the capability approach and not necessarily think about these questions. I'd now like to invite our two discussants, starting with Sonia Lutz, Dr. Sonia Lutz from the Center for Teaching and Learning. She'll talk to us for a few minutes just to share with us her thoughts on the paper and on your presentation today. And then when she's done, I'd like to invite Dr. Tendai Marova to follow up with his thoughts. Sonia?
Thanks, Mika, and thanks, Joan. That was really impressive, and the work you're doing is fantastic. And I really hope for the people who have joined that this is not too much of an anticlimax after your presentation. But I'd like to just share a few thoughts. I left Melanie's center a few years ago to join the Center for Teaching and Learning, and the work that we do is very pragmatic, and it informs academic and non-academic support structures that we build for students. So in reading the papers that were forwarded, and yours in particularly, Joan, I'm reflecting on this work from a very practical point of view. So in terms of what does this mean for our work in education, and particularly in academic and non-academic support structures, if the opportunities that enable students to flourish or to achieve well-being are relational? And I just want to comment on two aspects of the work. And the first is what you said we shouldn't focus on, is the actual relationships that are important in education. But I do think in our work it comes through so strongly. So I really just want to comment on that briefly. And secondly, to reflect a bit then on the higher level agency structure interplay and how that influences relational capability formation in educational contexts. So when thinking back on the educational research I've been involved in on capabilities and gender and student success and engagement and the COVID-19 experiences and so forth, relationships are absolutely fundamental to student success. From peers, helping students orientate themselves in a new environment, the transitional aspect of that, socially, academically, peers are accessible, relatable, senior peers in the form of mentorships. You also mentioned, particularly being a first generation student makes a really big impact, having that relationship with peers. Then with lecturers, we know that lecturers are the entryway to academic disciplines and the careers that the disciplines are associated with for students. And even from the lecturer side, we just completed a national survey on lecturers' experiences during COVID-19 and remote teaching and learning. And so many lecturers noted the negative effect of the absence of relational engagement with their students and the impact of that on the quality of learning that is taking place during this time. So then we also have parents who often want to but fail to support their children appropriately because of the vast majority of our students are first generation. So the intention might be good, but they often place additional pressure on their children. And then finally, of course, the relationship between students and the institution, which is important to develop a sense of belonging and a shared identity. So when reflecting on some of the educational capabilities that's been produced over the years, one can clearly see the link between capabilities and how they've been developed through such relationships. So, for example, in terms of practical reasoning, students' interactions with advisors or peers or mentors and teachers all help them to develop this capability. In terms of global citizenship, relationships between students and communities through service learning have been important contributors. And then the obvious social relations and social networks maybe, where students develop a mutual trust and friendships and working together to solve problems and so forth, which happens through several academic and non-academic spaces with education institutions. So what stands out in terms of the relationships enabling these capabilities is that these relationships can be horizontal with peers or vertical, and they depend on active involvement in the relationship from both parties. So, for example, to develop practical reasoning, one has to get feedback on ideas, which could be explained through social evaluation or interactional theories, and this requires active participation through self-examination. And secondly, as much as capabilities are formed through relationships, the opposite is also true. Relationships often cause adversity or unfavorable conditions. If, for example, educational relationships do not stimulate self-reflection or critical engagement with seeing oneself in relation to the world, or if the formation of capabilities are subject to adaptive preferences. So for some, as the example you gave in your paper, Joan, of CT, Different relationships can help to counter adaptive preferences and reimagine futures. But for others, the pressure from families or the weight of adaptive preferences might exceed their ability to see alternate futures. Then we also have capabilities where the relational formation of such capabilities depend on institutional culture or societal values. So, for example, the capabilities for respect, dignity, recognition, and bodily integrity can only be formed if the relationship or underlying values are enabling of such constructs. So during my time at the center, we did a participatory study on gender, and it was clear that while students experience the capabilities for respect, dignity, and recognition and bodily integrity to some extent through the relationship with the institution, particularly on campus, this changed when they went back home, where the structural arrangements weighed much more heavily than their own agency. So this leads us to ask whether it means that some capabilities formed through relationships in an educational context are limited to the educational context. It also relates to the example of Raphael that Joan also noted in a paper that leads to the claim that a relational approach to the capability of recognition or being recognized requires examining social relations that produce inequalities and finding ways to disrupt forms of indignity, social status, and injustices. In both the out-of-school youth and the gender example, it implies moving beyond behaviors and identifying the underlying issues and values, the underlying values and belief that form such cultures and behaviors, which is, of course, easier said than done. So at the end of the day, we need to ask whether it is good enough, or at least a step in the right direction, to focus on creating institutional cultures that enable the development of capabilities through different types of relationships with different people or the institution or the school, with a hope that the capabilities they formed here will spill over into the real world and consequently challenge societal values and beliefs that give way to inequities and injustices. Joan stated this much more eloquently, that we need to rethink how we teach certain skills or capabilities, such as critical thinking, responsibility, and self-motivation, so that agency is emergent and collective to generate new forms of justice. And I would add to this, within and beyond educational contexts. Then we further need to reflect on whether our roles stop at creating environments that enable students to form relationships, as we currently do, for example, through creating spaces during orientation or tutorial spaces and so forth, and whether we need to more actively contribute to the quality of relationships that will enable the development of critical capabilities in educational contexts, as opposed to leaving it to chance whether relationships enable or inhibit the formation of capabilities. So this idea also resonates with Joan's conclusion in her paper that an ontologically individual conceptualization of capability is of limited value in changing power structures and relations that create and perpetuate inequalities. So just the last thought, and importantly, as Joan also stated, a relational approach to capability development requires more than developing relationships in educational contexts. It requires that teachers and community members recognize, navigate, and change the structures that have created unequal opportunities. Only then will the value of creating capabilities through relationships be optimized in pursuit of social justice. Thanks, Mika.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for your very thoughtful response to both Joan's presentation and the paper. That was fantastic. I see that Tendai has joined us, and I hope that he's ready to share his thoughts on today's presentation as well. Tendai?
Thank you very much, Dr. Hopena, for the opportunity to be here, and also for sharing this particular session and the opportunity now that you have handed over to me. I would like to thank Prof Joan for the fascinating presentation and the thoughts that I think have been highlighted in the presentation itself, but also in the two papers that you shared with us. They actually, the thoughts are thought-provoking. And your presentation has reminded me of quite a number of aspects that were already going on in my head, and some of which we have been deliberating on with the colleagues, related to issues to do with educational capabilities, how it is conceptualized, and also relating to, at the same time, to relational capabilities. So this presentation comes to me in particular at the right time when I was trying to figure out how to navigate the maze, associated with trying to understand and also operationalize as well as theorize capabilities in education. So that being the case, I was actually, I'm more interested in understanding more how you have taken the debate about ethical individualism versus what is now emerging as a possible understanding of what others call communitarianism in the capabilities scholarship. Is something that speaks more to our context as Africa, and also speaks more to me as a person who tries to understand social justice within the context of Zimbabwe, where Ubuntu is used to operationalize or to inform education and also societal values. So it's at the level cutting across, your epistemological positioning, your ontological positioning, and also the values connected to this discussion. I think that becomes very key to me. And I was wondering whether your thoughts really speak to these thoughts that I'm talking to, which are now prevalent, especially in the southern, discourses. How do you situate yourself in such a scenario, and how can we make the philosophy of Ubuntu, so to say, more relevant for the type of understanding that we may want to advance as scholars from the Global South? May you also please try to respond to this notion that I am also grappling with, where the philosophy of Ubuntu is majorly attacked for being irrelevant, either as a philosophy that helps us to understand issues to do with number one, gender issues, number two, even issues to do with decolonization, where it is said to be not strong enough to bring out the nuances of power associated with the context of Africa, to say. Those are my few comments and questions, so to say, that I may want to pose to you. Thank you very much for the time. The reason why I've given all the questions and comments is because my network is not very stable here.
Thanks very much, Tendai. We appreciate you being able to join us and share your thoughts and your questions, which Professor DeJaeghere has now the opportunity to respond to. In the meantime, if you have questions or comments, thoughts that you'd like to share, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, once this initial response has been done to the discussants, we'll open up the floor for your questions and comments. But for now, if you'd like to respond to the two discussants. Thanks, Joan.
Well, thank you, Dr. Tendai and Dr. Sonia, for those comments. And let me just start from the last one about, this philosophy of Ubuntu, right? And how might it be relevant? And I just want to say that I think it absolutely can be relevant, and that we need to be able to analyze, not just take it as a given and as necessarily a holistic philosophy that's applicable to every space and every place, but to analyze within that how Ubuntu is actually operating, right, in certain spaces, or can be operationalized in the spaces of, say, higher education. So that's exactly what I wanted to hear from you and others is, what other sort of perspectives and thinking can help us to operationalize and think about this. Ubuntu is very much the I am because we are, right? The relationality, particularly between people, but it's also between us and the world. And so it does allow us to look at the relationship with other economic and social structures that we have created. So I definitely appreciate that you brought that question in, and would look forward to others thinking about how it can be operationalized, again, in the specificity of places and spaces. And I bring up that point about specificity because returning to Sonia's comment, or comments, thank you very much for those. I absolutely agree and appreciate the way that you talked about the different kinds of relationships that matter, particularly between students, higher education, and ability to be academically successful, whatever that might look like. I want to just clarify that I don't think, or I didn't mean when I said that a relational approach isn't only about relationships, that we shouldn't focus on it. I think we absolutely have to when we're talking about these different sort of power relationships that I was talking about between peers and others, or power that resides between people, right? But I wanted to say that a relational approach isn't only that, right? It's not only the focus on the relationships that we have with people, but it's about the relations in our society that human and non-human and that exist in our institutions. I have a number of thoughts I wrote down. Let me just look at my notes as you were talking. I thought that you gave some really nice examples of how it's important for those relationships between peers, but also you were talking very specifically about the relationship of students with their instructors and professors and how important that can be. And here's where I think that it's really the your own analytical use of a relational approach is already showing through, in that you said not only are these relationships important, but they can also have a negative effect, right? That they can repress or be oppressive. They can result in adaptive preferences. And that's where we bring in this sort of relational analysis, not to just say it as a given, right, that all relationships matter. It's about where and how they matter, in what ways is power moving in and through those to be helpful to shift some of the injustices that are happening. So in the end, I also appreciated that you talked about focusing on sort of institutional cultures, right? In the plurality, right? How do we create different cultures, policy, practices that might, and help people differently? What might be useful and helpful for a first generation Black student in South Africa may be different than some other student in South Africa. And similarly in the US. And we have this issue daily in our conversations in higher education. What's helpful maybe and the analysis we look at in terms of power relationships historically and present day for African American students is different than even African students who are more recent refugees, and is different than, say, our Indigenous students. And so that's where I think we have to focus on the relational analysis to look at some of those differences that exist. And that doesn't mean that there aren't some common structures that we can't have in our institutions to help foster better relationships. But we do need to do that analysis, I think, carefully and specifically, as I was saying earlier, with referring to, rather than assuming a more generalized notion that these sort of capabilities fit all people, or these values fit all people, or these institutional structures fit all people. And we know that is one of the powers of the capability approach, is that it can take that sort of, again, individualized from the perspective of sort of ethical individualism, focus on the individual, but from a relational approach is about how the individual relates to all these other structures. I think I'll stop there and take other people's thoughts or reflections.
Thanks, Joan. Thanks very much for that response. I see we've got one question in the chat. If people prefer to ask their questions directly, you can either raise your hand or simply switch on your video, and then you'll be given an opportunity to talk. But in the meantime, I'll just share with you a question from Professor Narend Bajnath, who says, what tends to pervade policy in educational transformation discourse is a strong utilitarian impulsion for understandable reasons. The legacies of colonization and apartheid weigh heavily on our current challenges and development. So his question is, what might we do differently in policy and planning that is sufficiently responsive to a capability approach? So that's one question. We're taking questions from anyone who's got, and they don't necessarily have to be questions. If you've got a comment, if there's a particular thought that crossed your mind as you listened to Joan earlier on or our discussants just now, please feel free to either raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask your question. Otherwise, you can type it in the chat.
So I'll take that question, and maybe we'll wait for some others. Or this is the challenge right before all of us, and I have no real absolute concrete answers. These are things we need to, I think, explore through a relational capability analysis, right? How do we do policy differently when it is so utilitarianly focused? And I guess I think this is where I do think that the focus that Melanie and others have had on what's the role of higher education in a public good is really critical. Because we need to shift the discourse, right? We need to shift the discourse in part to, yes, it has a utilitarian focus. There's no doubt that we all want to have better lives economically. But it also cannot come at the expense of other people, nor at the expense of our environment or the future of our children, right? And that's where the relational approach and where Smith and Seward, who've also written from a CA approach, also talk about how we have to think about not just today, but our future, right? The present, past, and future. And so how do we do it differently? Again, I have no simple answers. But I do think it means having really hard discussions about within our higher education institutions and with our colleagues about purposes of education. And what does it mean if our focus is on making sure everyone gets credentialed and trying to advance economically? That simply is not feasible. We know that underemployment is a key outcome of our expansion of higher education systems in many countries. Now, not everywhere, but many people with PhDs are completely underemployed. So I think we have to start to talk about, not just what do we want for higher education, what's the purpose of higher education, but what kind of society do we also want, right? That's the relationship again between what's the role of education and the kind of society we want. And do we want a society that is ever more consumerist and capitalist? And not to say that not to obliterate it. I'm not talking about obliteration here of, although there are definitely some people who are on that perspective, from that perspective, but I'm talking about alternative sort of ways of thinking about our futures and economies and our social lives and our environmental lives. That's probably less than satisfactory. I welcome other people's comments because I think it's more of a discussion than it is there's a simple answer to do it differently.
I agree, and I'd also be interested to hear what other people have to say in response to this and thoughts that they're having about these questions. I see that Bukola has their hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question or provide your comment?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I've actually used your article, cited it in my current doctoral work, and I have at least tried to use the relational approach. I think one of the challenges that I had was trying to sort of argue or justify the ontological compatibility of the different concepts that I was bringing together. And I think that's something that trying to have a relational approach really gets you to think about, because you're talking about combining the capability approach with post-colonial perspectives, with feminist perspectives. And in my case, I combined it with Bourdieuian concepts. So I was looking at basic education and sort of the relationships between families and schools in rural communities in West Africa. And you mentioned an important thing earlier when you talked about your own, if you will, epistemological perspective about believing that the world is fundamentally unequal. And based on the work by Melanie and Unterhalter and different kinds of people, there is a sense that the capability approach makes an assumption, which is not very explicit, that schooling is a positive good. Now, when you look at the work of Bourdieu and some of his concepts, he challenges that idea of schooling being a positive good. He sees the ideas of sort of reproduction and cultural reproduction really challenges that and suggests that actually for a lot of people, particularly in sort of low, poor income, disadvantaged situations, that schooling reproduces their poverty and reproduces that inequality. So my question then is, in trying to bring those two ideas together to form a relational capability perspective, how do you now argue for that ontological alignment when it seems that they're saying different things? Because one is saying that schooling sort of expands people's outcomes and possibilities, while the other is saying actually it doesn't really do that. So can you make an argument that justifies the combination of those two by saying it is possible to have differential outcomes within the same context, and thus combine those two different ideas? That's the end of my question.
Question. Is there any other questions, or otherwise I can respond to that a bit, but I wonder if there are other questions or comments.
There aren't any other in the chat at the moment, so if you'd like to go ahead and respond to that one, please feel free to. Thanks for the question, Bukola.
Yeah, so really good question, and I think that, I mean, here's the challenge. I too have used Bourdieu. I don't know if you've seen some of my work that's used Bourdieu, and you heard me say earlier that on the one hand we need to use this capability approach to analyze these power relations, and that if we have this ontological assumption that the world is fundamentally unequal, but a key element of the relational approach, as I said, is that it's also complex and dynamic. And so that inequality doesn't remain the same all the time. And yes, it can reproduce. And I think this is where Bourdieu, was critiqued early on for a long time. It still is, right? That you can use him to be overly deterministic, meaning that we can use it to just continually show how the education system reproduces the same sort of class inequalities in his case, or gender inequalities, right? Or we can use it to look for the dynamic kind of emergent changes. And there is some, and feminists particularly who've engaged with Bourdieu, including Julie MacLeod, whose work I draw on sometimes, McNay's work I draw on, really try to focus, and these are Western feminists, but there I think are other even more, take African feminisms and look at this and say, where do we focus on, rather than take an overly deterministic and structural approach, right, to this reproduction, how is it that change happens in incremental and small ways in individuals, and then in the individuals and the system, right? And so there's I think an orientation as well ontologically to be able to say both can coexist. We just if we're using Bourdieu, we're not using it in an over deterministic way to say that it's always reproducing the same inequalities in the same ways. And that's where I think more recently my attention has moved to, and I'm more interested in, quite frankly, analyzing those spaces where transformation happens. Because I think that we can get stuck in trying to analyze these inequalities and show that they persist. And no doubt, I'm not saying they don't persist in some ways, but there are incremental changes. And I wrote a recent piece from our work with Dalit girls in India that tried to look at the way that participating in education, being often the first in their family of a girl who participated in secondary education, was shifting some of the social relations in society. And in this case, it was shifting relations around, say, marriage, right, and work. And some of it is sticky, right? We call it very sticky, meaning that, you know, it doesn't really shift and suddenly just because I go to school, I no longer have to be married in my particular caste. That's not what we're saying. But there's a negotiation and a debate and these changes in small and incremental ways that are happening. And I think attention to that actually can be really powerful. That's why I bring in that component of the transformative into thinking about a relational CA.
Thanks, Joan. Are there any other questions, comments, responses? I mean, as you were talking right now, Joan, about, you know, kind of focusing more on the spaces where transformation happens and thinking about the fact that it happens incrementally, I started wondering, you know, people who kind of want to focus on the tangible and measurable, what would your response be to how we would measure and be able to see and understand these incremental changes and transformation, given that it happens, you know, so incrementally? How would we be able to kind of observe and measure that change?
Yeah, good question. And I should clarify, incremental may not be the best word, because incremental presupposes almost a sort of step-by-step linear process. And I think it's more one that you all know well better than I in lived experience, is more almost a struggle, right? Back and forth of movement forward, movement back. And I think I was just having conversations with colleagues here about just sort of our political and social situation in the US as well right now, and these questions of, will democracy last, right? And are there incremental changes that are going to happen that take us, you know, back and forth, or is it more of a struggle? But so how do we observe this, you know, in terms of, I mean, you know, there's lots of levels. Again, that's why I wanted to take a look at this at sort of like, if we talk about the education system and policies versus really looking more at much more micro levels, like what's happening in teaching practices or what's happening in individual spaces, right? With individuals and what Sonia was talking about earlier, these relationships with instructors or with peers, et cetera. I really think actually some of the participatory work that you all have done there, in terms of some of the participatory action research, is really, can be really useful, right? In terms of trying to document, because it's actually in these spaces where people are together in groups, you know, whether it be in classroom groups or groups formed outside of our actual traditional study spaces, where we see people having these discussions and debates and moving the thinking in different ways, right? And so trying to document more ethnographically and participatorily some of these changes. Now that's different than saying, okay, how can we take sort of indicators or measurements at an institutional level? I don't know if that was your question as well, Mika Teko. That was more your question. Yes.
I was thinking about both spaces. Yeah. Of where that change happens and how it's measured and observed.
Yeah, and you know, this is where, you know, the phrase, and a colleague of mine uses this often, is where we have to learn to measure what we treasure, what we value, because I think in institutions we get so caught up with, okay, measurement, right? This sort of smart orientation to measurement, which is, well, can we observe it? Is it concrete? How do we can we measure it in certain specific space and time? I think we're all fine. On the one hand, institutional measures and indicators can be helpful for, not unlike, say, the SDGs, right? They can be sort of these more aspirational goals that can shift the discourse that happens. but they probably aren't exactly what we should be measuring, right? It's impossible to measure them accurately and well, and focusing on that measurement takes us away from the processes. And that's what I mean about the relational approach, is that if we focus on the measure, then we focus on these outcomes and achievements, right? The functionings or whatever, often, without looking at the processes that we use to change those. And then we need to be able to document those processes. So, sorry, I might be getting more abstract than not, but I think that, yeah, we can have measures at institutional levels, whether it's in teaching and learning, right, or measures of policy and how those are shifting for, you know, creating better gender equity or racial equity or language equity, et cetera. But we also have to focus on our processes for achieving them.
I totally agree. But I was just interested in hearing what your response might be to people who are kind of like, how do we measure it? How can we see it? But yeah, the processes are obviously crucial for us to understand how these changes are taking place. Are there any other questions, comments, responses, contributions to this conversation? Melanie?
Thanks, Mikiteko, and Joan, thank you for a very provocative, I suppose, presentation, and one which I personally feel I need to go away and think about more. And I also want to thank our two discussants. I think they did a great job. Can I ask you to say more about the ontological aspects of the relational approach that you're advancing? Because this is where I get in a muddle, and I am feeling quite muddled. So I understand that from an ontological and philosophical Ubuntu-based perspective, one would understand relationality in the way that you described. I am because you are, and so on. But I mean, in that approach as well, relationships in and of themselves have value. And this is the argument that Thaddeus Metz has advanced, that relationships ought to be of equal standing or value as individual capabilities, because they have value in and of themselves. And that for him stems, comes from an Ubuntu philosophy. So I think where I'm still muddled is quite where the line is, or the differences between relationships and something which you see as ontologically relational. I think that's where my confusion is. And this Microsoft Teams tells me I can't send messages, but it's because I'm not a member of the chat for some reason, but it's probably better to try and express it in a rather muddled way in person. So if you can have a go to respond to that, but I acknowledge that it's perhaps not as clear to myself, never mind to anybody else at this point, because I'm trying to think about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Melanie. And I guess so as I said earlier, relationships are fundamental to just who we are as human, right? So ontologically, relationships, I think, are present in a relational analysis. We cannot be human without being in relation, right? Except that in our society, and I think I briefly talk about this in that paper, in our societies, we've also created systems, right? Systems of racism, systems of sexism, other things that have put people as unequal in those relationships and actually almost unhuman, right? We can, in some of those relationships, historically and present day, we see certain people, our systems, these systems actually see people as less than human. And so on the one hand, being human means we have to have these relationships. So I no doubt think that's a premise of an ontological basis for relational analysis. But what I was saying is that it's more than just looking at the relationships. It's also looking at, as I said, these systems that, of course, we as humans create. I don't actually, in my own thinking, analyze much systems that are created, say, through, ecological systems or biological systems or animal systems, but I suppose one could, right? But these systems that we've created have to be analyzed in relationship to our sense of humanness. So that's what I guess it was saying. We put a lot of emphasis in our analysis on trying to look at these relationships where affiliation happens, right? Or even how recognition happens. But we have to look at it more than just the relationships of people to seeing systems, right? And to the earlier question, right? Like, how do we think about the policies in our system that can fundamentally change? So analyzing that, I guess, is so the ontological basis of that even Owens et al. Article refers to is sort of this notion of, complexity and complex systems was sort of one of their philosophical premises for an ontological basis of a relational capability approach. And I guess that's sort of how I see it ontologically. I don't know if that clarifies it, but I'm trying to say that it's not just about relationships between people as humans, but humans in relation to. And so it's that analyzing of power structures. And, an example is we don't see, money plays very much into all of our lives, right? But it's not a human relationship, but we need to analyze that relationship in terms of how both economic policies or certain economic structures, taxes, or even something like fellowships, right? As a policy orientation that's related to the way money influences our opportunity to get an education. So we have to be able to analyze our relationship and the power that exists within those relations to material structures, and to other economic and social structures that we've created.
Thanks. That makes it clearer. I'm not there yet, but yeah, thanks very much. Thank you.
I look forward to having another conversation over coffee about that, because I think I'd like to understand, yeah, where the larger questions about the ontological principles or premises are.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a hand up from Carmen. Carmen, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. Thank you so much for this exciting presentation. I really love all those questions. I think we've been in the center really asking all those between ourselves and trying to figure it out how we can align local cosmovisions with the capability approach in a way that can challenge the traditional individualism. But I think another point that we've been discussing in the center is the tension that you're trying to overcome between individuals and structures and the resources circulating among the three of them, right? And this is linked a bit with Melanie's question. So the thing is, like, for me, it seems that you try to bring them together, but I'm not sure they are solid or steady enough to really provide a solid ontological ground to really push this forward. And I think the reasons goes in the way that Melanie was telling, but also in the way that we maybe perhaps talking about a feminist capability approach and not necessarily relational. And I get your point, and I think I really need to think carefully about this. probably I will join that coffee so we can discuss these ideas, because it seems to me that there may be kind of contradictions and clear points in how to see, because of these different currents of thoughts between agency, structure, individualism, collectivism. And I was thinking, like, okay, to make it more solid, do we need to go into a more concrete and a specific ground that not necessarily restrain the capability approach ontologically to that theoretical ground, but connect it with other ontological theoretical grounds of the capability approach? I mean, maybe this is somehow what the relational capability is trying to do so, and I haven't get it yet, but you get what I mean, in the sense that we can see that the capability approach is really rooted in Western economics and individualist kind of approaches. So is it a relational capability, a meta theory, able to bring together in conversation, but not necessarily closing the ontological, but acknowledging the different theoretical positionalities between capabilities, if that makes sense? Because when you bring feminists and decolonial scholars and bring also other Western thinkers, I think it's really powerful, and I think we've been also trying to make sense of that in the center. But yeah, I'm wondering whether so we think about relational capability approach as a meta level, able to connect other understandings, because we need all those ontological perspectives to make sense of the world and the complexity of education. But yeah, just a comment. I think this is probably a really big conversation, and yeah, but thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Carmen. Is another comment, or should I respond to that one?
I think you can respond to that one. And I was also just thinking what led you kind of to talk about this. I think in the beginning you mentioned intersectionality, but at some point also you were talking about how different theoretical perspectives have also come to kind of influence your work and your thinking around this relational capability approach. And I was wondering how it's possible to kind of either merge these, make them work together, what goes on top, what goes at the bottom. The questions that Carmen is asking, if there's a kind of fundamental ontological sort of new basis of the capability approach that's needed, or if there's a way to kind of integrate and merge these often what seem to be kind of, fundamentally different ways of looking at the world and understanding human beings and human relations. So yeah. No other questions from the chat.
Thanks for that, Carmen and Mikateko. Actually, Mikateko, what you were saying about what led me to this is what I was thinking about as Carmen was talking. And so some of what led me to this was early on, and not unlike many of you, trying to make sense of what Sen was saying about the capability approach, and necessarily looking at sort of the yes, we are focused on the individual and their achievements and their capabilities, but that we also must account for those personal, social, environmental conditions and this interaction, right? And then you always saw these sort of diagrams that try to diagram, the sort of environment one sits in, one's capabilities, one's functionings in almost a linear way with how these social and environmental structures might be influencing them. And actually, I think it was you, Melanie. I can remember quite a number of years ago when I put the sort of revised version of that diagram. I think it was at the World Congress. If it wasn't you, I'm probably not recollecting properly, but where you said something about, well, I actually think I had some place where I had aspirations affecting agency and where the social and environment were affecting capabilities. And you made some comment, well, I actually think these social and environmental factors affect both capabilities and agency, which I agree with, right? And aspirations also. So it's not this linear kind of movement through. We have this interaction of this environment, our endowments, our capabilities, and our functionings, right? It's much more interactive, and this is where I bring in the complex nation. So I think Sen fundamentally, ontologically is relational. I mean, he does say it in a few places. The question is, how do we specify what we mean by relationality? So that's why I was trying to specify it. And then how do we specify this more meta-theoretical, as you were talking about, Carmen, the meta-theoretical, which I would say, sort of where do we bring in then Ubuntu or which feminist perspectives, which post-colonial perspectives, right? To help us clarify what we mean by power, right? Which elements, because we can't look at it all, right? So we could have this really nice all-encompassing notion of what we mean by power, but then in any study, we're actually looking at more specific notions of it, right? Both as it comes out in our data or as we go in to look at something and then it comes out in our data. So what are the ways that we're looking at those power relationships, and how are we specifying very specific aspects of our social context? And I think that's where the meta-theoretical is helpful. And that's, Roybins does say we need that if we're going to talk about, more specific applications of this. And I'm just arguing in education, I think that we should, right? That was my fundamental purpose initially in some of that is that we should be more specific in having some meta-theoretical commitments, in ontologically specifying that there is a relational nature already embedded. I'm not calling for a fundamentally new CA. I think, Sen has put it out there some. Not that Nussbaum hasn't. I was also grappling quite a few years ago too with really liking a lot of some aspects of Nussbaum's specificity, right, of different capabilities, but also grappling with, well, but again, what does critical thinking do for you versus me in changing the inequities you're facing versus my inequities, right? And how are we fostering that differently for different people to achieve what they value? So, so that's sort of what led, some of the pieces that led me to this was grappling with sort of Sen's kind of way that he talked about it. Nussbaum's much more specific capabilities. And quite frankly, some early work that was done, I think it was Hill, I forget her first name now, into early 2000s, who critiqued Sen for not actually specifying what he means by power, right? And so then where do we go with thinking about how we define it and how we use it? And those are sort of meta-theoretical commitments. But I think what I was saying earlier is it gets us to a more ontological foundation, which is that we have to see these as relational processes. But if not, I think we're stuck more with sort of universal notions of these sort of structures would work for most people, and these sort of capabilities are necessary for these sort of valued outcomes.
Thank you. I think that really helps. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. We have about 5 minutes left, and I see that Bugola's put her hand up again for a question, so we'll take that question, and if there aren't any others, I'll be wrapping up after you respond to this last question. Go ahead, Bugola.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Melanie and Carmen, for sort of buttressing my initial interest in this issue of ontological alignment. And it's not really a question, more of a comment, and I'd certainly love to be at that coffee as well. But I think Melanie's question also relates to an element in my thesis that I actually don't really develop, but possibly in a future publication. But it is this again, going back to this issue of ontological alignment, that so we're, in a relational sense, there are different theoretical or perspectives or different concepts that we're bringing together. So that sort of stemmed from that relates to my question earlier about Bourdieu and CA, that in a way have different assumptions that they make about how the world operates. But Melanie's question also relates to, again, an aspect that I discuss in my work, which is in a really decolonial research where we are accounting for the epistemological perspectives of participants. That is also a theoretical perspective that then comes into that combination. So we've got a capability approach, we've got Bourdieu or post-colonial perspectives, but then we've got the epistemological perspectives of participants, if we are trying to account for that within our work. So Melanie's given an example of Ubuntu. In my context, that example was it's called Omoluobi, which is also this idea of relationships as an end in itself. So again, it is this question of how do we ontologically sort of justify the bringing together of these, in some ways, disparate ideas about how the world should be or what we should value.
I think you've hit on a very important questioning and topic that we should be taking up more. And I guess one thing I've had to has been asked of me, I have to ask myself, and I've asked of others, is at what point do we leave off certain theoretical ideas because they don't actually work and don't explain well enough, right? So we might start with Bourdieu in my own work, and it should be questioned now, like, why would I necessarily need Bourdieu to expand upon something that I'm trying to write from a CA perspective? And I might start there. I have started there with trying to specify a little bit more about the relationship of structure, or the relationship, the way I'm seeing agency, or the kind of habitus, right, that people have in relation to their families and the world in which they live. And maybe the idea of habitus can be useful, but maybe other aspects of Bourdieu can be left off, because there may be other things from our own data that actually help us to clarify more. Well, what am I really meaning by relationships? Or what am I meaning by the way that people understand the power they have, which in some sense is it about a certain, what sort of notion of agency is that or not, right? And so I think we have to be challenged. I know in my own work have to be challenged sometimes to say, when is something I'm using initially really not so useful anymore, especially once we get our data, right? So that's the idea of massaging theory in a sense, right? We take a theoretical approach, not an ontological one, because in this case, but a theoretical one like Bourdieu, and try to specify what we mean by certain concepts. And then if the data really help lead us elsewhere and it's no longer sufficient, then we should probably not use it. And someone asked me that actually. Actually, Melanie, I think you've even asked me at times, like, why do we necessarily need X in CA, right? Why do we need to bring this particular meta-theoretical perspective into CA? And I think it's only if it's about helping us at some point to clarify some of these meanings of concepts we're using in a relational approach, great. But then if it no longer has its usefulness and explanatory power, then maybe we leave it.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you to everyone. I think, yeah, we're just out of time. For me, it's been personally a very thought-provoking and a challenging conversation to have, and just listening to you talk. I think I'm definitely going to revisit your paper again and think about, different ways to kind of deeply engage with theories that we apply and sometimes don't apply, and whether or not we're doing it in a way that is really helpful for what we're trying to understand, not only in higher education or educational research, but in different disciplines that people engage in. So on that note, I'd like to thank Professor Joan DeJaeghere for really a fascinating talk, which I think is challenging and challenges all of us to think, as I said, very carefully about how we use the capability approach, and also different ways in which we can engage with and incorporate theories that might help us kind of grapple with these issues in a more helpful way. And thank you again to our two discussants for today, Dr. Sonia Lewitz and Dr. Tendai Marova. Thank you again to everybody who posed questions and shared their thoughts and their comments. This brings us to the end of our session today. Thanks once again, Professor Joan DeJaeghere.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the discussion. Have a lovely day and a good global dialogue at the HDCA.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing people there. Bye.
Bye-bye.